Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diaspora
Conoscere.
Falando.
Diaspora de parler.
Diaspora spricht.
Diasporas speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni, and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this podcast, together with our guests, we will explore the journeys, activism, and academic developments concerning Kosovo, Albanian, and Balkan diasporas to attain a deeper understanding of our communities scattered around the globe. In this episode, I will speak to Cairo Urovi, Fiola, and Arbor Gashi, among others, to explore how nationalism and heteronormativity intersect in Kosovo Albanian digital spaces, and how the digital sphere also serves as an empowering site for women and LGBT+ diasporas beyond the constraints of heteronormativity. Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Fiola, Arbor, and Cairo.
Thank you so much for having us, Rina. It's really exciting to be here and to speak about such an important topic with everyone today.
As perhaps by now you might have figured, with this podcast, we start the conversation with these questions. Where are you from in the Balkans, and where did you grow up in the diaspora?
My name is Cairo Urovi. I was born and raised in Italy. I am from Shkodër in Albania, and I've been living in London for the past 10 years now.
And we feel that we just recently met.
I was born in Kosovo. I came here when I was 5. I've been in the UK in London most of my life. I travelled a little bit for university, but that's about it. I'm a Londoner sort of through and through.
Arbor has been our guest before, but Arbor, we love hearing from you.
Thank you, Rina. I was born in East London. My parents are from Pristina. They came over during the early 90s. So yeah, that's me.
And today I have slightly changed this question because usually I ask what makes you think about diasporas, but today I'm asking, how do you place yourself within current diaspora discourses?
Really fantastic question. I think for me, it's a very tricky one because I think being a part of like the Kosovo Albanian diaspora within the context of London places you in a completely different positionality in comparison to those that are from Germany or Austria or Switzerland that have older diaspora experiences. It's always been really difficult to conceive my identity as somebody from Kosovo living in London due to the lack of representation, but also due to like the marginalization and racialization we face as a community as well, but also the kind of like the gray area of being from a place like the Balkan region that kind of like straddles the East and West. And this often becomes like a cliche for us. And I guess for me, my position within the diaspora space has always been massively implicated by a lot of confusion. And as somebody who is also part of the LGBT+ community, it becomes very difficult to conceive space within the diaspora space that tends to be very, very heteronormative and homophobic as well.
Thank you, Arbor, because this shows how multifaceted the diaspora is and how important it is to underline that. Cairo, you have this double migrant history from Albania to Italy and then London.
So my experience, how to place myself in the diaspora discourse is, I think my experience is fractured. That's how I would describe it. It's like a push and pull. I only started going back to Albania like frequently about 3 years ago. Before that, I would go back to Italy, and I only started finding my own Albanian community in London about 1.5 years ago. And it was comforting, but at the same time, I am the only trans masc person who's from Albania that I know in London. And I often am the only trans masc person that I know when I'm in Albania as well. It was like comforting to find my own community, but at the same time, I think there's levels of like transphobia in both countries that I have to navigate. And that's what I would say. It's definitely a journey, and I think I created my safe spaces in both countries, but it's definitely like a fractured experience in that sense.
And I think it is important you're underlining your positionality here, Cairo, because diaspora is often depicted as being all the same and the different experiences get lost. And because even within LGBT+ diasporas or community, the experiences are very diverse, depending on many factors. And it requires recognition because it also shows how alienated one can feel within if one does not conform to a preconditioned, confined set of roles. Do you share the sentiments, Fuel?
I guess for me, the way, if I had to sum it up in relation to the discourse, it's really about existing in opposition, in always existing in opposition to something. So if it's in opposition to British society and whatever that means, if it's in opposition to Albanian society in Kosovo and whatever that the connotations of that are, and even, not either place not being able to hold you fully and who you are fully and all the multi dimensions of you are not, integrated. I really relate to this. Something someone said something about fragmented. Yes, I think that is the sort of symptom, and the cause for me is that existing in opposition to things in societies.
The continuous clash, it starts at the doorstep, as one essay underlines. But for us living in the diaspora or abroad, away from our country of origin, public and political discourses are consumed through the digital space, for instance. And when we read something on the internet, it has a certain impact on ourselves. And the reason we are having this conversation today is how our community performs identity in the digital space or social media, and how these discourses place women and LGBT plus diasporas, especially because as we approach the 28th November Albanian Flag Day celebrations, a time when national identity is deeply emphasized, and unfortunately it is very constrained or tightly constructed view on how Albanian national identity is performed online. So to kick off with this question, how do you view the role of Albanian social media in shaping and enforcing a heteronationalist portrayal of Albanians? Fiola.
So I think for me, I had this feeling of feeling kind of left out when I went back to Kosovo outside of the digital space. So this is when it first sort of manifested for me was every year. I think there was a point where I didn't spend a single summer in the UK because my parents would just take us back to Kosovo for 6 weeks. So I had no concept of what people did in London in the UK during summertime. And I was always really trying to fit in with my family in Kosovo. And I made a big effort to speak Albanian really well and learn Albanian without any sort of formal training or education. Because it became a bit of a complex for me because I noticed that my family was sort of making fun of me or my siblings if we were saying things incorrectly. And then you felt just even more othered in a place where you were told this was home. And it didn't feel like that. It just felt like somewhere else where you had to prove yourself in a different way. A lot of the content that I do see, I remember a year ago when it was, Albania Independence Day, someone had overlaid the pride flag on the Albanian flag. I remember the person that posted that received so much abuse online, and they were just an ally, I think, that person. It made me think, firstly, some of the comments that people were making were, this is nothing to do with our culture. The pride flag, I guess, signifying gayness, queerness, has nothing to do with our culture, making it seem like two separate things that were at odds with each other. And then also people threatening this woman with very misogynistic comments. There were rape threats, there were death threats. So yeah, I think that when you see that happening to an ally, I can imagine that, as a queer person, you're even less inclined to promote that sort of fusion of your culture and your identity.
They're telling you this space is not for you. You're not entitled to take space, to make demands or live all your identities together.
Yeah, especially if you're someone that's in a diaspora, it's, you have even less legitimacy to make to conflate the Independence Day with queer rights and queer people in the community. And that's how it's perceived, that you're just a member of this detached diaspora and you're trying to import your crazy ideas into Albania and into Kosovo. So yeah, I think that would put a lot of people off that expression.
I think for me, the biggest issue that I find is like social media versus reality. and the way that the Albanian family or Albanian people are perceived through social media. Like I was going through TikTok the other day and I saw this depiction of Albanians being like super blonde hair and blue-eyed and like pale skinned. And like it just doesn't speak to the reality of my own personal lived experience of coming from family where you have individuals that look super racially ambiguous, darker skinned, olive. And that doesn't mean to say that Albanians can't be blonde hair and blue-eyed and have these features. Our community is super diverse in that sense. But what really frustrates me is like it's almost like since post-war in Kosovo, post-communism in Albania, there's been this massive kind of like neo-colonial Western approach to identity. And I find Albanian social media especially to be kind of like massively grappling with this issue to a point where they're trying to conceive or produce a new identity that doesn't speak to the reality of who we actually are in terms of our cultural practices, our religious identity, the realities of who we are as a collective group. So they're kind of like trying to create this homogenized identity that doesn't speak to the reality of who we are as a community and the diversities of being an Albanian from Kosovo or from Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Greece, wherever it may be. And so I think that's the biggest issue that I have with Albanian social media, it being extraordinarily unrealistic and being based in like these oftentimes, like you spoke about meme pages, but like incel Albanian cultures extraordinarily profound and like super violent and based in, of course, homophobia, of course, racism, of course, sexism and discrimination. And it's sad because I see a lot of Albanians relate to these pages as well, because they do, like you said, produce culture and we want to see our culture produced, but then equally trying to adhere to values and a structure of society that just simply doesn't speak to the reality of who we are, from my opinion anyway.
So what you're saying, Arbor, is that the online space in a way is enforcing or emboldening an imagined identity that is not representative of the realities in place, because as you're saying, there is much greater diversity within Albanian communities in Kosovo or the diaspora. But Cairo, in our last conversation, you said something similar to Fiola. You said, I don't have this particular experience online.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not part of the algorithm on my phone, doesn't fall into that category or into that aspect of Albanian culture. I just don't see it online. So I don't tend to participate in it or get involved. And also I find it very interesting to just like witness it, because when people say, oh, I'm proud to be Albanian, I'm always curious, what does that mean to you? And what values do you uphold when you say that you're proud to be Albanian? If then your next post is going to be something homophobic or transphobic, because that's not what my values are, obviously. So I just find it, I'm curious to just witness like people kind of like post about these things and just like voice how proud they are. And I think for me, I've just had to, like, when I say that my experience has been fractured, I think it's very interesting for me to come into my own trans masculinity in London, being from the Albanian diaspora, and especially seeing how Albanian men act or behave, like, especially like obviously cis, hetero Albanian men act, how they define themselves in their own masculinity. And sometimes I've had to kind of like face that and actively choose not to participate in those behaviors that are actually harmful and reconsider what that masculinity means to me and how to kind of like deconstruct that in a way that is healthy for the community, for everyone else, because a lot of the ways that men act and think that they are masculine are actually very harmful. And so this is what I'm kind of like thinking when I think of the social sphere and also in real life, you know.
And as a woman, being critical in the online space, I well resonate to the violence one receives when standing in a position to disperform masculinities. And this has then real material impact on our lives. For women, for LGBT plus communities, who often then from this online abuse and behavior and hate also learn to navigate their bodies in the offline space as well, because one becomes aware or overly aware of one's own position in these discourses. And something that on my initial conversation with you, Viola, you mentioned something about moral conditioning and a loss of community one feels within these discourses as a woman or as part of the LGBT plus community.
I think you can feel like you need to choose is how it feels, I think. And that's often the reality for people. They are forced to pick between the conditional love based on a rigid interpretation of what it means to be an Albanian or something else, whatever that is. And I think that regardless of whether it's because you're queer or because you're choosing to live a different way of life or you're just deviating from that default position, I think that's perceived as a threat. And a lot of queer people, specifically queer people, feel that the love they receive is conditional based on them adhering to the expectations of this, whatever people think it means to be Albanian in our community, in our broader community. And I think that's why a lot of people hide, and that's why a lot of people have extreme mental health challenges whilst they grapple with decision or choice to come out, the Western understanding of coming out. And I think that, yeah, that can make people feel really isolated and lonely. And I guess coming back to your question about having to pick, it is a choice, but what is very philosophical, like what is choice? It's a decision that you come to because you're forced to come to it. It can feel quite harsh, and that you have to be really extreme and you can't be in the grey area. You have to be very black and white, binary about the decision you're going to make. Am I going to be authentically me, or am I going to be something else? And what does that mean? And do I have to do that because I want to keep certain people in my life, you know?
There is, I think, this expectation that one's identity is like the clothes you're wearing, and you can unwear them and wear them on depending on whom you're facing. And also one element that is curious about these debates is, often in Balkan spaces, religion and nationalism do not go hand in hand, or they do. But at times within these discourses, priests or imams tend to align their views, emboldening nationalist masculinities. For instance, last month, I attended the launch of the Balkanism First Physical issue. For the launch, several panels were prepared. And in one of them, someone conducting research on the Orthodox Church and LGBT communities, if I recall correctly, said something that stayed with me. You cannot speak about LGBT plus rights without speaking about religion. Do share this view, Arber.
Most definitely, because I think religion has such an important structure within our cultural communities as well. Oftentimes Albanians get preoccupied with this, the religion of Albanians is Albanianism kind of approach. And I think we don't really recognize that religion is also a key part of our cultural identity, whether Muslim, whether Catholic or Orthodox, whatever it may be, religion holds a part in our lives. But the fundamental issue with that is that religion is often weaponized against a lot of members of the LGBT plus community. Fuel, you spoke about kind of like the notion of like deviancy, something that is really repackaged and just perpetuated within Albanian spaces so significantly. And recently there was some discourse in Kosovo, as is always usually the case, over the civil code and whether they're going to legalize gay marriage. And what really triggered me was the way that individuals were speaking about like LGBT and the Albanian family as issues that are in complete polarization with each other, as though LGBT plus people are not a part of the Albanian family, if that makes sense. Like, where do we come from? They almost kind of like dehumanize us and turn us into these kind of just like these individuals that are born out of nothing. We grew up in Albanian families. We are a part of Albanian families. And I think that's something that has really always very much triggered me in that sense as well, because it creates a sense of opposition, like you spoke about, that conditional nature, and bringing religion into it as well. When religion is in the mix, and as somebody who grew up, my family are nominally Muslim, as are most Albanian people, but Islam was a big part of our identities as well. But the way that it was always kind of presented to me is that to be a good Muslim is to follow a certain way. And if you don't follow that way, then you are deviant and you are X, Y, Z. And I think that's something that is really significantly difficult because the mental health issues that occur in individuals, whether it be also related to drug and alcohol abuse, whether it also be related to having real difficulties when it comes to sexual education, etc. These are issues that are rife within the LGBT plus community, and it's precisely due to structures like religion and culture that really uphold these really problematic standards. And for me, like when my grandma was telling me about religion when I was much younger, she preached peace and she preached love and she preached me to be a good person. And so when I see wider kind of like imams, priests, whoever it is, use religion in a way that further causes discontentment and harm to communities, it really just doesn't sit well with me in any way, shape, or form. And I think from a theological point of view, we can have debates and arguments about what this, that, and is said, but like key tenets within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever the religion may be, are really promoting peace and love realistically.
I wanted to add that we need to talk about shame and how much shame is being used to kind of just brainwash us into thinking that we're doing something wrong. And also talking about deviance, like, yeah, I'm a gender deviant, and what? Do you know what I mean? Like, and what? Like, I think queerness and transness are so threatening and feel so threatening to culture and like in Albania because they bring a different way of thinking and living life that people can't even imagine. I think transness and queerness bring other possibilities of what it means to be yourself and walk through the world as you are. People are afraid of that because they're afraid of deviating from what they know. And actually, there's a lot of joy in that. And I think when talking about shame, it's like this thing that gets stuck in you so much. And one of the joys of having found my community in London is that I've been able to unlearn that shame with other people because you can't just unlearn it by yourself. You know, it's like a choice to a certain extent to resist that, but you can resist it more easily if you're in community with each other. That's what I wanted to add.
عليك يا رسول الله عليك يا حبيب الله عليك يا رسول الله عليك يا حبيب الله
Thank you. Caro, thank you so much for mentioning shame as an emotional mechanism for control. I think academically, Lauren Berland, if I'm not mistaken, has written about this effect and the question of community in this regard. Shame can be used or is a social mechanism employing emotion to control bodies and minds or social conduct within a community. So thank you so much for mentioning that, because I think there is unawareness how shame or other emotions are instrumentalized for control. And I think Arbor wanted to add something also.
Kara's point really like hit the nail on the head in the sense that shame is such a prominent structure within our community as well on so many different avenues. But what I find really interesting is like different cultural shames, if that makes sense, or like different experiences of different homophobias. So like living within the diaspora space, not only do we have to deal with the implications of homophobia as perceived and conceived within Kosovo or Albania, we also have to deal with the historical baggage of homophobia within Britain and the British kind of like homophobia that exists. So it's kind of like you're navigating two communities, you're navigating two kind of like structures of power that kind of really want to shame you and also kind of like bastardize your identity and bastardize who you are organically and naturally as well. And I think that was something that was really difficult for me because I would go into like English LGBT plus spaces and be met with a lot of kind of like cultural xenophobia or also Islamophobia, but then go into a lot of kind of like Albanian spaces more generally and then be met with homophobia, but also the notion of like West toxification. I think an academic spoke about it. So like us Albanians that live within the Western world, we've basically been manipulated by the West and now we're all LGBT and we're kind of like trying to bring it back to our communities and our cultures when the reality is that a lot of our communities and cultures have such an extensive history of these identities prior to them even having rights within the context of the Western world. So I think that is that dynamic of always having to face different types of systems quite persistently is very, very, very tiresome and exhausting for many of us.
I really relate to that. I think I grew up in a really sort of inner city London environment, and the first time I left London was for uni, and I realized I was in a bit of a bubble because I grew up around Arabs, Somalis, Albanians, and then I ended up going to quite a white British institution, which was actually quite harmful for me in some ways because it forced me to reckon with my otherness, which it's transformative ultimately, but in the moment it can feel quite painful as an experience. I never really had time or the space to come to terms with my sexual identity and my queerness because I was dealing with so much already. And I think a lot of people can relate to this who sort of come to that understanding of themselves later on in life. I think something that Kyra, you said about choice is a really empowering thing to have. Choice is the opposite of what a lot of people in our community have. And I think a lot of our mentality and the rigidness is in the perception that there isn't a choice. And I think that causes the shame sort of holds that all together for me. I think for women, for example, being a bisexual woman, there is a lot of, I guess, animosity towards that because it comes back to choice and people thinking you have this element of choice. And choice is, I guess, centers women's sort of sexualities, right? So being bisexual, you're like kind of saying, I have a sexuality, I have a choice in my sexuality. And I guess that can feel like an admission of desire as well, which in our community is really taboo. Even non-sexual desire is really taboo in our culture, or any kind of having a wish for yourself, not being part of the collective, not being the we, not kind of indulging the we culture. It can feel really threatening to the Albanian community. So I think having this sexuality that deviates from the norm and what people understand to be the norm is really threatening to Albanians because it implies some agency, especially when it comes to women. It's like, wait, hang on, you actually have thoughts and desires that are individualistic. That's really strange. That's really scary to me, actually. So I think that's from a woman's perspective that you asked me about this, Rena. I think that's kind of how I see it and how I experience it when I am open with people about who I am. I think that's the first sort of reaction that I feel from them is this sort of fear of not knowing how to place me and not knowing what box to put me in.
And this reminds me of Adrienne Rich and compulsory heterosexuality, the expectation that women should be attracted to men only and not uncover their desires, because for lesbian or bisexual women, uncovering desires would then entail living their own identity. But also something that we also spoke about in our last conversation was how women within the LGBT plus spaces themselves are marginalized.
Yeah, and I think we spoke about how actually that's just a symptom of the society we live in, that women's voices are generally unheard, and that it's no surprise that even in queer spaces, that's the case. I do think that in certain Western cultures, that's having a bit of a turning point, actually. There are way more sort of resources, tools, representation. There's way more representation for queer women in the Western world, but I do think it's still a problem in the Albanian community, especially within the diaspora. I think even me talking about it today is really going to be quite controversial.
And to bring in another feminist reference, but what you're saying very much reminds me of Gloria Anzaldúa, because she lived in the borderland as a queer feminist, Chicana. But the reason I am mentioning her because her work challenged the binary thinking. She often takes the borderland as a metaphor for what is represented in the border, meaning the margin. From what you're saying, it's living on the edge, a constant on the edge of the community as a queer diasporan. But to mention another point, and thanks to you guys for highlighting this in our initial conversation, it's not only about survival. Something that Cairo also mentioned was the experience of the Burdnesha, a gender practice in North Albania, being important in your journey, Cairo.
Yeah, I say trans people have always existed throughout space and time, and people seem to be very surprised about that. And and then I don't understand what's surprising about that, because obviously I think that's quite obvious to me. I'm not the first one to exist in my family, I believe. I'm not the first trans person, and the kind of discovering this tradition of the Burneshas before I started medically and socially transitioning was quite enlightening and interesting to me. I basically I'm pretty sure I actually found it online on Instagram. I'm pretty sure I found a picture of a Burnesha on Instagram, and then I Googled it and I found out. So we're talking about the digital sphere. I wouldn't have known unless I had been on Instagram and that had showed up on my timeline, which was pretty sick, to be honest. I actually just remembered. But the Burneshas are this group of what I would see as transmasculine people. And it's this tradition based on the canon, which is this old book of rules that has existed throughout, I don't know, centuries, I believe. And basically in the northern regions of Albania, when the male member of a family passes away or something, like there is no man of the family, the eldest daughter essentially transitions into the man, and they basically gain male privilege. Like they dress like men, they smoke, they hang out with the other men in the village, but the catch is that they need to be virgins. Like they can't have sex for the rest of their lives, so they're called the sworn virgins of Albania. And that's, in my opinion, that's because if they had a kid, that would be a bit gay, because now they're men having a child with another man, so that would be a bit too much for the village community to witness and see. And I think we can hold both truths at once, those being that it's very sexist and it's also a form of gender diversity that has existed in Albanian history throughout time. And that's basically the two things that I found when I first found out about them. I was like, oh, this is quite problematic, but also, oh, like these are essentially old trans mass people that lived like 2 hours away from me. And so I like having found this before I even thought about transitioning, because it was basically just a way of me to see that it is possible to exist and be transmasc and I can actually make it my own way without it being sexist. You know, like I don't need to prescribe to these notions. Like I can actually just transition and be transmasc or genderqueer. I don't even see myself fitting into the binaries of man and woman. Like I'm not a man. I don't prescribe to those. I didn't transition just so that I could fit into another box once again. I'm actually trying to break away from all of these things. I see myself as a gender migrant, actually, when we're talking about crossing borders and being between borders. That's what I am, a migrant between one border to the other. My existence is about making that grey area as joyful as possible and provide that space for other people. That's what I would say my work is about.
I think the great difficulty is that so much of our histories have been kind of like perceived through a very heteronormative lens. So when you are somebody who is queer or LGBT, coming to terms with your identity, you look back on your history and there's nothing that you can find because it's all been kind of like hidden away and locked up. And this very much hush hush kind of approach is taken by our parents' generation. But when you start kind of like insisting, I was the one that was insisting with my parents and be like, Mum, Bob, like surely there was something there. It couldn't just have been, straight people. And then I start hearing stories about, the really flamboyant man. My dad used to work in a bazaar in the market back in the day in Pristina, and he used to tell me how there was this Roma man dressed to the nine, perfectly dressed, super flamboyant with a hat going out in the market. And people used to shout, obviously, pejoratives towards him. My dad, thankfully, never did that, obviously, but people would be really disrespectful to him. But he had like this grace about him and he did not give a shit about what other people were saying. But he was perceived as a queer man. Or the fact that my mum, she's a lover of Turkish music. So I grew up listening to Zeki Müren, who is a very, very famous Turkish singer in Turkey. He's passed away now, but he originally actually comes from Macedonia. His parents were from Macedonia. And we kind of grew up with his music. So it's really difficult then because then you start finding all these individuals and start hearing all these stories, but then there's such a layer of silence and like masking and erasure of them. So it becomes really difficult to kind of decipher your own history and try to make sense of your own identity. And like Cairo, when I looked into Albanian history, I saw, narratives, I saw poetry speaking about some type of homoeroticism. I read passages of Albanian Highlander men, which is kind of like the depiction of the utter level of Albanian masculinity going up into the highlands for months on end and having sexual and romantic relationships with each other. Reading about, stories of like gender dress being quite different when it comes to certain traditional Albanian dances, or when it comes to the song, what's it called? Dulbera, and that song having massive connotations related to queerness. And it's something that's not just present in Albanian culture, it's present in most cultures internationally. When you go, like, for example, the Hydra in South Asia, Fafafine in Samoan culture, various different other communities have desperately tried to kind of like, it's really sad almost because all of our cultures have been impacted by heteronormativity. And because heteronormativity is such a ingrained social factor, they've had to make these categories of gender in order to express a gender queerness, if that makes sense. So it's actually so enraging almost and so frustrating that heteronormativity is as prominent as it is as a structure, because it has basically forced individuals to adhere to certain gender norms, but also establish these really fixed gender roles, even if it's one, two, three, in a really problematic way.
Everything you're all saying, I really relate to, like listening to Turkish music made by gay men. And I think there's actually, not to say that straight people aren't creative, but I think there's a specialness in queerness can be quite abstract. And I think that there's a diversity in looking at life in a more abstract way that's more common in queer people, I think. And actually, a lot of our music and culture that is reproduced is probably made by queer people at one point in time. So a lot of the joy that people experience, and ironically, a lot of the reproduction of the culture through this music, through these folk songs that could have been made by queer people, probably were made by queer people, that it's now associated with this really homogenous way of looking at being Albanian, and the sort of incel culture, ironically, was probably made by a queer person at some point. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's not all suffering. And actually, there's a lot of joy in queerness, a lot of creativity in queerness. That's why a lot of the queer people I know are really passionate about music, art. And I think that's aside from your preferences. I think that's the thing that's sort of one of the things that brings a community together as well.
And that's such an important point to highlight, because even within the Muslim tradition, divan poetry tradition, queer creativity has bloomed, and queer history is very much part of Albanian history and tradition. However, as Arber mentioned, it is hushed to the margin. And as you also just said, however, there is much nuance to the discussion. There is joy in queerness. And we appreciate the joy Arber brings with the Balkan London collective. Can you tell us more about this initiative, Arber?
Exactly, because I think although I expressed myself quite frustratedly in my answer beforehand, which is very valid, because obviously I think sometimes as gay men, especially, we're perceived as like the gay best friend and always being happy and fun and go shopping and go clubbing and blah, blah, blah. But we're actually fully realized human beings with like a real complex set of emotions, and being frustrated and angry is equally as valid as also experiencing profound joy. And I think that was something that I was passionate about, because I'm really passionate about cultural production and cultural engagement as well. And I wanted people from the Balkan space, especially within London, because I don't think a spaces like this have ever existed before, to really engage in their culture, to listen to the songs that they love, to eat the foods that bring them nostalgia, to feel the vibes of home in a London space, and also not feel threatened that they will get beaten up on the basis of their LGBT plus identity. And that really pushed me to create Balkan London Collective with Tamara. And we kind of created this collective because we saw the necessity for it. And we basically kind of launched kind of like an annual Balkan Pride event. So we did the first one in 2023. We did another one in August, and we had Balkan drag queens and traditional music and traditional food, and the vibes were immaculate. And individuals just loved kind of having that space to actually congregate and see a different narrative of being Balkan and LGBT, because you know the saying, what is it? You can't be what you can't see. And I think that's something that's really, really important, because for me, and I think both Fuel and Cairo can relate, like growing up, I thought I was the only one. And so when other LGBT plus people from the region, they may stumble across our account and they see these spaces existing, but they also see us as individuals existing and also being quite successful in each of our industries. It really does provide inspiration and also like a feeling of I can do something, my journey doesn't stop. Because I think for me, it's quite dark, but I thought like it would all end at the age of 20 because I couldn't go on, kind of thing. But then it did go on, and I was able to live a fully realized life. With that being said, I also think that recognizing the privileges that we have living in London is also quite significant. I have the privilege to be able to do this and to be quite vocal and open with my life, whereas a lot of people back home in Kosovo and Albania, they don't have that privilege. So it's equally great to create these Balkan spaces for joy for LGBT plus people, but it's equally deeply, deeply sad that I have to look at people back home. And although spaces do definitely exist out there as well, they are often kind of like put to the margins.
And these spaces and initiatives serve as counter-hegemonic spaces that speak against the grain, or hegemonic discourses, whether it is heteronormativity or colonialism or other dominant discourses. Arber has created a community to celebrate queer life. In a similar way, however, a narrative-based approach, you, Cairo, use your photography to tell your own story.
So I'm a visual artist and photographer. I've been working on this project called Stray Dog for the past 3 years. And it's about me going back to Albania after 11 years. And I was 2 years into my transition. So I showed up and I said, hey, to my extended family who didn't really know much about my transition. So the project and the work is about me inhabiting the streets of my hometown as this character, this stray dog that belongs to the streets, but also doesn't really belong to anyone else. And it's a lot of self-portraits, basically, of me on the streets, performing and playing with the environment around me and wanting to disappear, but also claim my own space in it at the same time. So there's this tension when I talk about my fractured, fragmented experience. There's this tension of wanting to be there and be seen as myself, and also wanting to run away because I don't always want to be the visible trans person, you know. So that's what my work is about. And I think initially it was about trying to find a link and connection and wanting to belong there. But soon I realized that I can never really quite belong there. So it became about that not belonging or trying to, that attempt to belong.
And recognizing this requires a lot of courage that you do not want to belong to the set of confined conditions, rules placed upon you, creating your own space and a community. And this brings us to the end of this conversation. And a question that by now I ask in every episode is, if there is one thing you could bring from Kosovo to the diaspora that is missing for you here, what would it be?
If you had to ask me, and if I had to be honest, I miss that time, that sort of innocence I had of not realizing how I was perceived by my family and extended family in Kosovo, where I thought actually for a moment I did belong. And that was definitely an illusion because the sort of undercurrent of not belonging was always there. But that innocence that I had at the time sort of protected me from that. And I did feel for a brief moment, a few summers, that I did belong somewhere and I felt very protected. I felt very held. But of course, as you get older and things become more complicated within yourself, you start to unpack that much earlier, I think, than you would have otherwise. And I think that can feel like a bit of a grief. And so I'm ending it on a negative note. But yeah, I guess I would return to that. I would bring that innocence, even if it's just for like a fleeting moment, to experience that again, because with that came a lot of warm feelings.
That's a valid emotion and feeling. You want to bring it back. And I also very much resonate with this grief. But Arber and Cairo, have you thought of what you would bring?
I think kind of like leading on from Fiola's point on kind of like innocence. The thing is, right, although like our communities are very heteronormative, one thing that I think for me was really important is my family is very female dominated. And so one thing that I would potentially bring is the fact that whenever I was around women, I could actually just be myself, if that makes sense. So like with my tiers, with my cousins, like dancing, to tuna or like dancing traditional to traditional music or something, just like being myself, like especially around women, that was something that was it just was so natural to me. Like I would dance how I wanted, I would express myself how I wanted, I would play Barbies, I would do whatever I wanted, and it always felt like such a safe space, especially in Kosovo, especially post-war. Obviously, there was that great euphoria of Kosovo being free finally, but then also like having my grandmas and like having my aunties and having my female cousins just like invite me into their space and not feeling so bad about it, because I remember every time before we'd go to Kosovo for the 6-week holiday, as everyone did back in those days, they would always sit me down and say, Aubrey, you can't really do the things that you do in London back in Kosovo. But like I'd go there and I would still be able to do it with the women around me. And I think women have always played such an important role in my life of like providing me safe space. So I think that's something that I would bring, or because as you get older as a man, like the thing is like a lot of my work deals with a lot of like very sensitive related issues, especially in regards to women. So I always have to like, because I'm quite tall and big and like I've got a big beard. So like people perceive me as like this big guy. So like sometimes I really need to recognize my own positionality because I never want to make women feel uncomfortable. But when I was a child, obviously I was a child. So I could access those spaces in more freedom, and they were very, very beautiful, which is understandable why women are so protective of their spaces as well.
Yeah, oh, but I agree with that. I love my girlies. Like when like talking about Albanian men and masculinity, I don't really have many Albanian male friends just because of that, because I think we threaten each other's masculinity so much that there's just this massive like clash. So a lot of the people that I end up being surrounded by are like Albanian women because they're amazing, And my answer to that question, I don't know, I was thinking I would bring back my granddad's fig tree from Shkodër because no one everyone stopped caring for it after he passed away. And every time I go back, really just not making any figs anymore. And so if I could bring it back to life and here, have it in my own garden, I think that would be lovely, because my grandparents raised me essentially. My grandparents lived with me until I was 13. And then I would go back in the summer to Albania, and then I would stay with my grandparents there. So all of my memories are tied to them. Yeah, that's something I would bring back.
That's so beautiful. I am this close to crying, but such a beautiful ending to this conversation. Thank you for making me cry. And thank you so much for joining this discussion today. I'm very thankful that you accepted my invitation and that you chose this platform to share your experiences.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Rena.
Thank you.